here in Barre, Massachusetts, the traditional homelands of the Nipmuc Nation. In fact, we had a Nipmuc language concert in our Dharma hall earlier this year. And before introducing Joseph Goldstein, I would like to give you some sense of how the evening will unfold. First, though, let me say that if you would like to have closed captions, then you can see the text in real time of what is being spoken. If you look at the bar across the bottom of the Zoom screen, you can press the button which says Live Transcript and CC for closed caption. So the first part of our evening will be mostly a conversation between Joseph and me, and I'll be asking questions about poetry and Buddhist practice and about Joseph's own practice of writing poetry that will be in some ways based on the interview that was linked in the announcement for this conversation. And then during the second part of our time together, Joseph is happy to take questions from anyone who's on the call tonight. If you do have a question at any point, please feel free to send it to me in the chat, and I will collect them and pose them to Joseph. I suspect there will be many more questions than Joseph can address tonight, which is a good thing, as living with a question is often better than getting an answer. And if you really don't want an answer, you can chat something to Joseph because he will not be able to see your chat. If for any reason you're having difficulties, technical difficulties at any point, getting back on Zoom or anything of the sort, please feel free to email contact@buddhistinquiry.org. And thank you so much to my colleagues, Cassie and Mindy, for making all these logistical processes work so smoothly. And before we get going, Mindy, if you could open up the chat for everybody to see each other's chat, and I would invite you to say in the chat where you're calling from and take a moment to look through the Zoom screen and wave to folks you may know on the, or may not know. Toronto, and Providence, Florida, Montreal, Chicago, Vancouver, Sri Lanka, Oregon, Vancouver Island, Manitoba, Ojai, California, Philly, Yosemite. Who's in Yosemite? Lucky you. Maui, Vermont. There's always something moving to me about seeing all these people from so many different places. Santa Fe, Marlborough, Vermont, Salt Spring Island. Okay. Thank you so much, everyone. Guadalajara, Mexico. Okay. So let me just start by saying that Taiwan.
There's also someone from Moldova, Eastern Europe, which should pass by. So,
thank you for catching that, Joseph. Yes, welcome. Welcome to everyone, wherever you are, in whatever kind of body, whatever kind of mind. So pretty much every Buddhist tradition has understood that the ultimate teachings, or the teachings about the ultimate, point to an experience or an awareness or an object of experience or an object of awareness that is typically described as beyond words and concepts, so beyond language. Language, it is said, is inadequate to grasp the ultimate ground of our experience. And maybe even more than that, language just isn't just inadequate. Language ensnares us, it beguiles us and kind of leads us to think that things might be different than they are. At the same time, all these Buddhist traditions have also generally believed that words are capable and necessary of somehow pointing beyond themselves to help us, help others, help ourselves have some opening, have some sense of the ultimate. And perhaps for that reason, from the very beginning, from the suttas and earliest stories, poetry has played a very important role in Buddhist traditions. Even many of the Buddhist figures who we might associate most with rationality, like the Indian philosophers Nagarjuna and Dharmakirti, or the Tibetan philosopher Tsongkhapa, the Japanese thinker Dogen, they all wrote poetry. And they wrote poetry both as an expression of some experience, if you will, of the ultimate, and also to support others in getting some sense of the ultimate. So poetry is this really interesting form of language that in some sense allows us to move beyond itself, beyond language. And during the first year of COVID in 2020, Joseph Goldstein sent me an email asking me if I'd be willing to read some of his poems and give him some feedback. And maybe in the back of my mind already then, I had this conversation in mind when I first started reading his poems. Many of you know Joseph as a meditation teacher, someone who is so clear in their teaching, both with regard to doctrine and practice, and also delivered with humility and a sense of humor. And the author of too many books here to mention that have been translated into many languages and have been so supportive for beginners and advanced practitioners. And I am so grateful for all that work that you have done. And also as the co-founder of the Insight Meditation Society next door to us, and together with Sharon Salzberg, co-founder of the Barry Center for Buddhist Studies, and Joseph has been a longtime board member. I suspect that many of you are familiar with Joseph as a teacher, an author, an institution builder to support meditation, and my hope tonight is to introduce you to Joseph as poet and reader of poetry. And with that introduction, Joseph, maybe if you would be willing to lead us in a short settling meditation to begin.
Well, thanks, William. I must say, being introduced as a poet is the most daunting. Dharma teacher is one thing, but poet is quite another. Let's just sit for a couple of minutes, settle into the body. Maybe take a few deep breaths. Just feel oneself sitting, feeling the breath. May all beings be at peace.
Okay, thank you, Joseph. So you started writing poetry in your 70s. Do you remember when you had last written poems before that?
I actually started writing poetry when I was in the Peace Corps in Thailand in my early 20s. But in thinking back to that time, I realized in a way I was more inspired about the idea of becoming a poet rather than a real kind of exploration or appreciation of poetry as a mind space and as a quality of sensitivity. So the motivation was quite different at that time. But after I left the Peace Corps and came back and then went back to India to begin my practice, my intensive practice, I really had dropped the writing of poetry for the most part until I was 75. So there was like a 50-year hiatus. So it was quite remarkable, when it started surfacing again.
So you actually wrote a poem about what happened in your 75th year.
Yeah.
And I am wondering if you would be willing to share that.
Sure.
With everybody tonight.
Yeah. So it's called The Muse. Something happened in my 75th year. A channel opened to oceans of space where words sparkle in their sparse delight, calling, calling, calling. Something happened in my 75th year. The channel opened to oceans of space where words sparkle in their sparse delight, calling, calling, calling. And that's really what it was like.
Before you say any more,
Yeah.
Mindy, I'm wondering if you could share. Oh, there we go. So thank you, Mindy. There's a link in the chat. And as we go through the poems, they will show up on the Google Doc. So if you press on that link, you should get to it. So yeah, Joseph, would you be interested in saying a little bit more about what you're expressing there?
Well, first what happened, I was just on vacation with friends in Spain. A couple of friends, we were staying in this beautiful villa-like place, a little way out of Barcelona. And it was the first time I had been in Spain. It was really beautiful and just settling into that whole environment. And a friend of mine who I was with had been talking about this Vietnamese poet, Ocean Vuong, young Vietnamese, who had come to the States. Beautiful writer, both nonfiction, fiction, and poetry. So as she was speaking about him, Googled, and of course there was, maybe it was on YouTube or something, he's reciting his poetry. And it was just so beautiful and so evocative, and it just awakened something in me, listening to his poetry. And I think it was that very evening, I went up to my room and all of a sudden, just the poetry started coming out. It was really quite remarkable and very unexpected. And my friends happily were very supportive. So even in those very first few poems, which were varying quality, but they were so encouraging, which was very helpful, and it kind of did encourage me to keep up with it. So it really all started flowing from that. And in this particular poem, it really is kind of the beginning of that connection between poetry and meditation in terms of the space of mind out of which either insight comes or poetry comes, or the blend of the two, the merging of the two. And so it's a very rich experience, kind of seeing the poetic mind space and the meditative mind space being, if not exactly the same, very similar, and similar in its creative potential. So that's really, for me, what this poem was about and how it all began.
So would you want to say anything more about calling, or oceans of space where words sparkle?
Yeah. So for me, and especially I think this is a fruit probably of the many years of my meditation practice, especially when the mind has some degree of silence, where it's not just filled with, the random thoughts that we're so familiar with, but in that space of silence, as the words of the poem began to emerge, it was like the words emerging into this vast space. And each word was like a unique appearance. And it had that sparkling quality and also that quality of sparseness. And I really appreciate kind of just the simplicity. It was not very elaborate language. So it was kind of this merging of, being in that quiet space of mind and then having these words come. And it's as if they were calling me to express themselves. So it was quite a delightful experience.
So I've been emailing on and off for a while with Ocean Vuong's publicist. And he's agreed to do an event with the Barry Center for Buddhist Studies. So
fantastic.
He will be the second poet whose poetry will do reading. So Joseph, in the interview you did with Amy Gross, that was first published in Tricycle, and then we republished in the BCBS Insight Journal. In response to Amy saying that she had been feeling lonely and you suggested poetry as an antidote, can you say a little more about what you mean about poetry as an antidote to loneliness, and just unpack that for us?
Yeah. Well, I think we can get stuck in the idea of loneliness. And what I found was that writing poetry and just being in that sensitivity of mind out of which poetry comes, it really transforms what we might initially think of as loneliness to the feeling of aloneness. And these are quite different things. And even when we hear those words, I think we respond to them quite differently. Because loneliness is a kind of contracting into ourselves in a not so pleasant way. We feel deprived or lacking something. Whereas aloneness, for me, opens up to a whole new space that's beautiful. So there's one poem that came to mind in this regard, which I think captures this transformation from loneliness to aloneness. It was written by one of the ancient Chinese poets, Li Po, and it was a short poem, and these are just the last two lines of it, where he wrote, "We sit together, the mountain and me, until only the mountain remains." And so I could easily imagine sitting together, the mountain and me, and feeling really lonely, But then until only the mountain remains, we take the sense of I out of it. And we're just in the fullness of the total experience. So that's a great expansive quality rather than the contraction of loneliness. And I think poetry does that. We might start out with a feeling kind of self-centered feeling. But as we bring the poetic sensibility even to that experience, it's transformed. We began to place whatever that experience is in something larger than ourselves. So it's a beautiful move, from loneliness to aloneness. And in that aloneness, only the world remains. Where we're not, the ego self is no longer the center of the experience. So it's very dharmic in that way. We can almost think of it as a glimpse or a taste of selflessness, which of course is the key to all of the Buddhist teachings.
Yeah. You have a poem called Love of My Lonely Hours.
Yeah.
Maybe this is an appropriate time to read that.
This is one of my favorite. So, love of my lonely hours. Years ago, winter cold brought joy. Now, love of my lonely hours fills the winter gray silence, and poems like Christmas candles illuminate the night. Years ago, winter cold brought joy. And now, love of my lonely hours fills the winter gray silence, and poems like Christmas candles illuminate the night. It's also a reflection on aging, because especially as winter's coming now, and feeling the cold that's happening, at least here in Barrie, it's nowhere near as pleasant as it used to be. I used to love winter, and be out in the cold, and now in my elderly years, the cold is not so pleasant. But there's another thing that happens, and this time, the love of my lonely hours fills the winter gray silence, and poems like crystal candles illuminate the night. So there's a beauty that comes out in this aging process as well.
Yeah, that's a lovely poem. I really enjoyed that one.
Mm-hmm.
It reminds me of what you say about intimacy, because the way you talk in the interview with Amy about being alone and the space that's a source of poetry, there's also intimacy there. And I'm wondering if you could say something about aloneness and intimacy in poetry.
Yeah. Well, I think I did mention this in the interview. For a long time, I've had this idea to write a 2-paragraph book called The Myth of Intimacy. And for me, the myth is that it requires someone else to be intimate with. And in my experience, and this really came first out of meditation, and then kind of is expressed in this whole poetic endeavor, it doesn't take another person to be intimate. It's as if we have to take ourselves out of the way, and then it's really, we could say it's becoming one with everything in our experience, no separation. And for me, that's the essence of intimacy, non-separation. And it's just a beautiful space because we're so connected. And this really came, and it's very obvious and probably to most of you listening now, in meditation. Our meditation experience, in my experience, is extremely intimate. The feeling of intimacy with the breath and the body and our emotions and thoughts and what we see and hear, because there is no separation. There's just the awareness of what's arising. So there's another poem which may have wanted to speak about later, but really fits in here. And it happened when I was on my own self-retreat. And I was just doing walking meditation, up and down my driveway. And I heard the song of a bird. And very spontaneously, it's this haiku-like poem arose in my mind. Bird song in the empty sky of my mind. Bird song in the empty sky of my mind. And the difference between the intimacy of that experience and our usual perception of, okay, I'm here walking on my driveway, bird is in the sky, there's a sound, where there's separation. And to see that all experiences are appearances in our minds, our hearts, that in a way is the essence of intimacy, because there is no separation there. So that's why I feel that the meditative space and the poetic mind space is just so similar. And in a way, my experience has been that poetry gives expression to the intimacy that we discover in meditation. So there really, it's a beautiful interweaving, between the two.
Yeah, that's lovely. I received a question from someone who's on the call tonight that feels appropriate for this moment. Amy Gross, when she was interviewing you, talked about doing a Buddhist writing retreat with Ruth Ozeki at the Barry Center for Buddhist Studies. Ruth spends time at BCBS, and at the end asked what people want to do with their writing, and Amy said, well, I don't want to publish. And the question that came in is about the skillfulness of writing just for oneself, and not worrying about anybody else reading. And I'm curious, given what you were just saying about intimacy, if you have any thoughts for people who might be invited, feel a calling to write, but maybe not interested in sharing it with anybody else.
Oh, absolutely. That really was my own initial feeling about it. I was actually quite hesitant to show it to anybody, and it really was just the expression of my own experience, in various settings, and it actually took a little prodding to share. And I think that's probably quite natural when one is beginning any new discipline, and not being particularly accomplished in it. So there's a little hesitation. But my first foray in showing it to anybody was just to get feedback, and so I could, hone the craft a little bit. But I think writing for oneself is a beautiful thing to do. It in a way, it enhances the quality of our sensitivity to our experience. And it's just a beautiful space to be in. So definitely, even if one never shows it to anybody, I may be misremembering, but I have some recollection that Emily Dickinson never showed her poems to people. Is that accurate? Or
they were mostly not published during her lifetime.
Yeah. So, he's this great poet. And so I think that it's a beautiful thing to do.
So you were just talking about the resonance between meditative perception and poetic perception. You have this lovely phrase in the interview, the poetic mind space. When you're in the poetic mind space, there's a way in which perception has the space to flower. And I think you were talking about that when you were talking about the bird song. Is there anything you would want to add to that? Like what it means for perception to be granted the space and the attention to flower?
Yeah. I'm sure many of you tuning in this evening, I'm sure have a meditative practice, and many of you, I'm sure, have been on retreats. So it really has to do with our growing ability to quiet the mind. Because as we all know, when we start practicing, the mind's just filled with thoughts and we're carried away over and over again. But over time, as the mindfulness gets stronger and the concentration deepens a bit, the mind actually becomes quieter. And a common experience on retreat, and I've experienced this often, and I think it's quite common, that as the mind gets quiet, we just notice things and perceive things, ordinary things around us in a new way. And just a few examples, we might see and perceive in a new way just the branches of a tree against the sky, which in our normal life we would just walk by and we probably wouldn't pay any attention to it. But somehow when the mind is quieted and we're moving a little more slowly, just such ordinary things can become so beautiful. When we're paying attention to the details of whatever the sensory input is. So I think this is a really common experience, in meditation for people. And that's what I mean when the mind is quiet, that gives the space for this level of sensitivity to be experienced and then potentially to express itself, in poetry or some other art form. But for me, again, to be experienced, expressed in words. But it has to do really with the mind becoming quieter and the potential in that mind space. And one of the great potentials is just this poetic expression. So again, to me, it just shows the link between our meditative practice and our creative expression.
There's another link, I think, in what you have shared about poetry, between poetry and meditation, and that is that we can have painful feelings, either sensations or other forms of pain, physical sensation or other forms of pain, that when we bring our mindfulness to them, they can soften a little. And my sense is poetry for you can play a similar softening, supportive role. And I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about that, if there are any poems that come to mind that might address that for you.
Well, first, just to talk a little bit about why I think that happens. A lot of the meditative process is just learning to see how much we're identified with what's happening, whether identifying with the pain in our bodies or identifying with painful emotions. And the meditative process of mindfulness is to begin to become aware of all of these phenomena, whether pleasant or unpleasant, without claiming it as I or mine, without that process of identifying with it. And I think that's what gives us the space, and as you say, kind of softens the experience because we're not so caught up in it. We can simply open to the experience of it. And in that softening, and I think if we are undertaking to write about it, and this is why I suggested to Amy originally when she came in saying she felt so lonely, and I suggested writing poetry, because even beginning to write about the feeling of loneliness, the feeling of deprivation in some way. But as soon as we begin writing about it or trying to express it, we're no longer drowning in it. We're no longer so completely lost in it. And so then it just opens us in a really beautiful, in a way, it's a combination of an artistic and a scientific view of what's happening. right? Scientific in the sense, okay, take loneliness as an example. Instead of just drowning in and being lost and maybe feeling sorry for ourselves, we just take it as a feeling to explore. Oh, loneliness feels like this. Right? And then the poetic side, which helps us in that, is giving expression to it. And that, in a way, it opens up the whole experience and different dimensions of it. So for me, it really fosters kind of a deeper appreciation of the nuances of whatever the experience is. And so it can really help. I mean, it can help with anything, but particularly with those things we're very stuck in. Poetry can take us out of it, and have us experience it in a much more sensitive and nuanced way. And there's beauty in that. And what I may mangle these lines because it's been a while since I read them, but those famous lines by Keats, truth is beauty, beauty, truth, and that's all you need to know. It's something like, what's the last line of that?
I forget what the last line is, but I remember what you're talking about.
Yeah,
I'm sure somebody else remembers on this call and could put it in the chat.
Beauty, truth, all you need to know, something. But there is that merging in a way. The poetry opens up. It opens us a little bit to the fullness of the truth of whatever the experience is. We're seeing it in a broader way, in a deeper way, in a more sensitive way, as we try to express it in poetry. That's what's so beautiful and so joyful.
Yeah. So, I'm curious, you said that you were wanting feedback and wanting to improve your craft. And I'm curious what you think of the process of revision as a practice.
Yeah.
And maybe this is more generally artistic discipline and revision and reworking, and what kind of a practice that is and how you make sense of that in relationship to Buddhist practice.
Well, in a way, I think revision is just another word for practice. And it can be with any discipline, whether it's poetry or music or sport or meditation. That practice, this may be stretching things a little bit, but we could think of practice as a continual revision of our understanding as we keep on repeating and practicing, whatever the particular discipline is, or even within the context of revising a single poem. So, maybe there's the first stab at it. But then the process of revision is cutting away with everything that's extra, and we're trying to find the essence of what we're trying to express and what our experience is. So I really see it as practice, and very similar to mindfulness practice. It takes a while in practice even to come to a deeper understanding of what mindfulness means. When we start, people can have all kinds of ideas of what mindfulness means, but that understanding gets refined as we practice it, and as we fall into the various pitfalls that come along the way in meditation. And I think it's the same thing with poetry. We fall into the pitfalls of extra words or too abstract or whatever. And the revision is continually refining. But I had to learn that, because I think I mentioned in the article when the very first attempts at all this, I had this kind of, first thing out is the best. But that's very sophomoric, and And I really value this poet friend who said, all of poetry is revision. That really helped me a lot. And I've come to really enjoy the process of revision, because just finding just the right word or deleting what's extraneous, or it feels like it's sculpting words in space, and there's something, I don't know, it's very satisfying to me, to remove what's extra or unnecessary or not quite to the point. So that's the whole process of revision and of meditation.
Yeah, that was really beautifully said. For the past few years at BCBS, Roz Driscoll and others have been leading a Dharma and art program, and we're hoping to have another month-long program online next year. I think Roz was suggesting the title Dharma in the Studio, but just exploring the ways in which Dharma practice and studio practice or artistic discipline, all the ways in which they resonate, integrate, complement each other. So one of the traditions of Buddhist poetry is the tradition of the death poem as a genre. Many prominent poets have written poems as they've approached death or very close to death, or as death has been on the horizon. And you have a number of poems which you call Harbingers. I'm wondering if you would be willing to say a little bit about the Harbingers and maybe share one of them with us.
Yeah, well, I think for all of us, and a very, particularly for those of us who the aging process is becoming more and more evident. It's at a certain point just is unmistakable, and it's revealing itself to us all the time. So in these last, 4 or 5 years, as I've been noticing that in my own life, it often has become the subject of my poems. So this is one that I wrote, Lazy Day at 76. Morning coffee and a first glimpse into the unknown day. Waiting for that pulse of life to push through the pale joy of sitting, doing nothing. Going for a walk is almost too much on this day of questionable ease. Is it simply resting up to save the world, or the faint glimmer of decline? I'll decide tomorrow if I awaken in the morning light. Morning coffee and a first glimpse into the unknown day, waiting for that pulse of life to push through the pale joy of sitting doing nothing. Going for a walk is almost too much on this day of questionable ease. Is it simply resting up to save the world, or the faint glimmer of decline? I'll decide tomorrow if I awaken in the morning light. And one of the things that I was trying to express in that, and I'm pretty sure this is common experience for people of a certain age, but I notice it increasingly, as we begin to feel just different little things in our bodies. But at a certain age, I just started wondering, well, does this mean something? Is this important, or is it just a passing ache and pain? And so is the uncertainty of what things mean really struck me, and so on that particular morning, I was just sitting and doing my morning routine, but feeling not so inclined to engage in the world. I was just sitting doing nothing, and then wondering, okay, is this the beginning of the decline? Or is it just resting up? So it's those kind of questions that I think that come in the aging process, the wondering and the uncertainty, and the gift of holding it as a question, rather than jumping to a conclusion.
I'm curious for you, Joseph, if your relationship with this uncertainty changes through the writing of the poem.
Yes, well, what it does is it takes the anxiety about it away, because at first, when we begin to notice these little things that could be problematic, but probably are not, but we're not sure, and so at first the uncertainty could be a little cause of anxiety. Oh my God, what's happening now? But as soon as I started writing poetry about it and just expressing it, and giving words to the uncertainty, then it just put it in a whole different context, and it was a context of, in a way, it was a context of amusement, of just watching my mind consider these different possibilities. Okay, am I dying? Or is it just feeling a little tired? And to be able to hold it with humor as we see our mind go through these uncertainties is a tremendous relief. It just softens everything. I'll decide tomorrow if I awaken in the morning light. So having a sense of humor, I think, is really helpful both in meditation and in poetic expression. I'm a big fan of that because it kind of weakens the stranglehold of self, where we can be amused at our own minds dealing with things like aging and illness and dying. So I think poetry really helps in that way.
Having a sense of humor helps in meditation and in art and in life in general.
Yeah, absolutely. It's highly recommended. And mostly to be able to laugh in a way at our own minds, and just with all the things that it does.
So, Joseph, you often use poetry in your Dharma teaching as well. And so when you're teaching at IMS or elsewhere, you often bring in poems. And I'm wondering if you would be willing to share a poem that you use in your teaching, and maybe say a little bit about why you share that poem as opposed to just giving a more didactic teaching at that moment.
Yeah. So this is really one of my favorite Dharma poems, although I have no idea whether the poet K. Ryan actually has a meditative experience or not, but this poem so expresses the essence, one of the essential points of the whole teaching. And I just love the way she did it. So it's called The Niagara River by K. Ryan. As though the river were a floor, we position our table and chairs upon it, eat and have conversation. As it moves along, we notice, as calmly as though dining room paintings were being replaced, the changing scenes along the shore. We do know this is the Niagara River, but it is hard to remember what that means. So for those of you who are joined and who may not be so familiar with the geography of North America, the Niagara River flows over the Niagara Falls. And if, for those of you who have been there, you know that this is a massive, powerful waterfall. Big, tall, powerful. So here we're floating along as though the river were a floor. We position our tables and chairs upon it, eat and have conversation. As it moves along, we notice, as calmly as though dining room paintings were being replaced, the changing scenes along the shore. We do know this is the Niagara River, but it is hard to remember what that means. And it's such, to me, a powerful, vivid expression of how we live our lives. You know, we do know that life ends in death. You know, there's this very potent Buddhist reflection in the teachings where the Buddha said, what has the nature to grow old will grow old, to grow ill will grow ill, to die will die, and we are not exempt. And he suggested that we reflect on this daily because for some strange reason, even though intellectually we know that's true, we think we are exempt or we should be exempt. And that's how we're living our lives. We're floating along the Niagara River, you know, with all the changing scenes, and we're so caught up in the scenes that we're seeing that we're forgetting that it is the Niagara River. You know, that the nature of life is to grow old and to grow ill and to die. So, and I love her last lines. We know this is the Niagara River. We know this to be true, but it's hard to remember what it means, right? We don't often apply the profundity of that understanding to the choices we make and how we're living our lives. So I think that poem just beautifully expresses it.
So the poem beautifully expresses this way in which we are like Ivan Ilyich in the Tolstoy story. We know the syllogism, all people are human, all people are mortal. I am immortal, I will die, or Socrates is immortal, Socrates will die. But what do you think there is about the poem that makes it effective for teaching that's different from the syllogism?
Yeah, because we all do know it conceptually. You know, so that's not the problem. It's not that it's an esoteric truth. So we know this, but it's the image of going over Niagara Falls. So it's like it said, a picture is worth 1,000 words. We could talk about impermanence and dying and give a whole hour-long Dharma talk on it. But here, in just a few words, she created an image, which to me is just so vivid. Floating along the river, yeah, and there's Niagara Falls. So I think it brings that conceptual understanding to a different level. We connect with it, I think, just in a more powerful way. Oh, yeah, this is what is really happening. So I don't know whether, you know, the people listening have the same response to this poem, but for me, it really captured in a very vivid way the nature of the flow of our lives and where it's going. And we know it's the Niagara River, but we forget, it's hard to remember what it means. And this is the remembering what it means for how we live.
Yeah. So I've received a number of really rich and wonderful questions. And if other folks have questions that they would like to send me in the chat, feel free. Maybe before we move to those questions, Joseph, is there another poem that you would like to share that you use in your teaching that does something similar as the Cape one?
Yeah, so I mean, there are many, but one that I really like a lot and is so expressive of the meditative experience, for us individually. It's called Watching the Moon by Izumi Shikibu, the Japanese woman poet. I don't have her dates. It's a couple of hundred years ago. I can't remember exactly her dates. So watching the moon. Watching the moon at midnight, solitary, mid-sky. I knew myself completely, no part left out. Watching the moon at midnight, solitary, mid-sky. I knew myself completely, no part left out. And I think this is a powerful statement of the completeness of the meditative journey in terms of understanding ourselves. Because as I'm sure most of you know who have a meditative practice, we see all kinds of things arising in our bodies, in our minds, in our hearts. Some are beautiful and joyous and uplifting, and some are really painful. Difficult emotions or regrets or feelings of guilt or whatever. It can be a lot of anger or rage or or ecstatic feelings. So there's the whole range of what it means to be alive, to be a human being. And the meditative process is really, mindfulness is really learning to open to it all without judgment. A genuine, choiceless, open awareness where we can see every part, of ourselves. And this is a process, and it takes practice, because for the very uplifting qualities, it's easy to get attached to them. And for the really challenging ones and painful ones, it's very easy to try to push them away or not want to open to them because they're so painful. So it takes practice, and it takes developing that steadiness and stability of mind. Okay, let me be with this. Let me be with this. And in that process, we really are purifying this whole mind-body process. So we're not holding on to anything, we're not pushing anything away. And we come to a sense of completion, we come to a sense of wholeness. So I just love that part. I knew myself completely, no part left out. So there's tremendous power in that, and integrity, in terms of understanding ourselves. When no part is left out, there's very little room for self-deception, because we just see it all. But we have to come to that place of the strength of our hearts to open to it all. And again, I think poetry can help us open to things that are difficult as we get into this poetic mind space of expressing what those feelings are about or what those experiences are about. It uplifts us out of being caught or lost in them. And it just puts us into a much larger space of beauty.
Yeah, thank you, Joseph. The moon poems also reflect the fact that in some Japanese traditions, the moon was taken as an image of awakening, and there was a practice of gazing at the moon. And there was a full moon on Tuesday, 2 nights ago. And if anybody wants to, here's an invitation after this evening, after our conversation, to go outside and gaze at the moon and have some sense of that intimacy.
Yeah.
Okay, there are a lot.
One
Yeah,
second. There's one more poem that I'd like to do. Not my own, but this is a poem I love and is so appropriate, I think, for all of us on the spiritual path, on the meditative journey. It's called The Art of Disappearing by Naomi Shihab Nye. So, when they say, "Don't I know you?" say no. When they invite you to the party, remember what parties are like before answering. Someone is telling you in a loud voice they once wrote a poem. Greasy sausage balls on a paper plate, then reply, if they say we should get together, say why. It's not that you don't love them anymore. You're trying to remember something too important to forget. Trees, the monastery bell at twilight. Tell them you have a new project that will never be finished. When someone recognizes you in a grocery store, nod briefly and become a cabbage. When somebody you haven't seen in 10 years appears at the door, don't start singing him all your new songs. You will never catch up. Walk around feeling like a leaf. Know you could tumble any second. Then decide what to do with your time. And so to me, that poem just reminds us that throughout our life, we're making choices of how we spend our time and what's really important. We don't want to wait until we're on our deathbeds to decide what was important in our lives. We want to really reflect on that now and make the appropriate choices, and that's what can be so enriching, about the spiritual journey and about waking up and the possibility of poetry enhancing, that understanding. I love the line, when someone recognizes you in a grocery store, nod briefly and become a cabbage.
That may be good advice for other moments in our lives also.
Oh, absolutely. So that goes to a sense of humor again, and so we can really be relating to profound understandings also with humor.
So there are a lot of great questions, and maybe we'll start with one related directly to retreat practice. The question came in, so one is sometimes often recommended on retreat not to read and not to write. And you are giving an invitation to a way of practicing perception, attention through the writing of poetry tonight. And the question is, what do you think of this kind of writing while on retreat?
Challenging question. So I have two different heads that are going to respond. One head is my Dharma teacher head, and I would say, don't write. The other head is my poet head, and I would say it's actually a beautiful space. So somehow how to combine the two. I think it's really helpful to have retreat time that is really devoted just to the mindfulness practice, not reading, not writing, deepening, the formal meditative practice. So I think it's really important to have dedicated time for that. It could also be possible just in one's life, and it might not be on a formal retreat, but to take a day or to take a weekend where you could almost think of it as a poetry retreat or a writing retreat, where you might sit and then write, and then maybe walk and then sit and then write. So you actually are interweaving the two and giving yourself the chance to explore the space we've been talking about. So I think it's possible to do both. And I perhaps even encourage you to do both, because it's a beautiful thing to do. But I wouldn't detract from the time of formal intensive meditation practice when you have the opportunity to do that. I would just add in these other opportunities. And it could be for a shorter period of time.
Mhm. So thank you, Rhonda. The question that just arrived, I think, is a question that many people might feel or might be struggling with. And when the world is calling so with such intensity and such need, for example, to bring an end to all the various forms of violence that we can see and many that we can't see. Some might say, well, writing poetry is a luxury, and shouldn't the bodhisattva be out trying to bring an end to the violence and suffering? I'm curious if you have any thoughts about that.
I do. I think it's a full separation, because I think artistic expression can be a powerful teaching and a powerful expression of, for example, the horrors of war. And so two examples came to mind just off the top of my head without having given a lot of thought to this particular question. But I think of Whitman writing about his experience in the Civil War, and he spent years during the Civil War attending to and nursing the horrendous kind of carnage, the wounds and the soldiers who had been mutilated, and he was very involved. And in some of his writing, he gives expression to that. And so it actually is a way of communicating the horrors of it and the potential for compassion in the midst of it to a huge audience. And then the other example that came to mind was, I think I have this right, but if not, correct me. But I think it was Picasso who painted Guernica. That powerful painting of it coming out of the Spanish Civil War. Revealing kind of the horror of it. And so I think artistic creative expression can enter into these situations of tremendous conflict and suffering, and in a way make it accessible and vivid, for a lot of people, maybe even more so than some article we read in the newspaper. And that's the power of art and the power of this kind of creative expression. So I wouldn't separate. Like, writing poetry is not only about writing about beautiful things. Sometimes it's writing about the things that are most difficult and challenging. and trying to communicate something about that. So in my understanding, I don't see any conflict, and I think it can actually be of great service to touching people's hearts about these situations.
Yeah. Helen, in one of the comments, reminded me of the Audre Lorde essay, Poetry is Not a Luxury.
Mm.
And it's been a while since I read that essay, but my memory is that she's arguing there that, especially for women, poetry is, for reasons that you were talking about earlier, it's almost a necessary activity in a society where the feelings of women are subordinated. And poetry is a practice that allows, she's talking specifically about women there, to, but I would say it works for me also, for all of us perhaps, a practice that allows us to, in some sense, understand and see our feelings for the first time and respond to them. And in that sense, it is not a luxury, but a necessity to take care of ourselves, to do any of the work that one might otherwise do in the world.
So,
yes, I'm getting other great references. As Lori is pointing out, it's difficult to get the news from poems, yet people die miserably every day for lack of what is found there, the William Carlos Williams quote. So I wanted to ask another practice question on retreat, and maybe you've already addressed it, but I'm curious what you think of this very specific instance that someone brought up, where they actually had a Dharma teacher on retreat who suggested that during walking meditation, one way of maintaining one's attention or perception is to think of haikus while doing walking meditation. Maybe you just have a different take on it than their teacher. Or,
you know, I'm a big proponent, both in life, but also in meditation. I'm not being afraid to just experiment and explore. Mm-hmm. I mean, is probably not a traditional practice that many of our Asian teachers would have recommended. But in a way, that poem about birdsong, in the empty sky of my mind, that came in walking meditation. I wasn't trying to write it. It's just what came to mind. And so that could be another approach. That is not with the intention to write a haiku, but perhaps having the intention just to stay open and receptive, and sensitive to perhaps a unique way of seeing things, or the first time we see things in a different way. And so that might be an interesting thing to do at times. And then one can see, is it really distracting from the practice, or is it helping in some way? So I'm not afraid to explore in that way. Yeah. Even though some of my teachers might not agree.
So here's a question I found very moving from someone who is feeling like they're unable to do sitting practice at this time, and wondering if the writing of poetry could basically be a form of meditation, and if it might support renewing the meditation practice that they're having trouble with now. If you have any words to that.
I would explore that, and it may be, without knowing the details of why it's difficult to be engaging in a meditation practice, but just as an example, one common difficulty that people have is when the mind just seems out of control. That no matter what we do, there's just endless thoughts, and it's hard to settle down, and we get frustrated and give up. So it could be, for example, that taking time to write poetry is a way of quieting the mind. And so we sit and we engage in this process, and it would be interesting to see, as we do that, if the mind does feel like it's quieting and just getting more attentive to the details of whatever we're writing about, as the mind quiets, then to see, okay, can I move from that space into even 5 minutes or 10 minutes of a more formal meditative practice? So it could be the doorway, that leads us to it. But it's worth exploring. It might work in that way, it might not. But I think it's definitely would be an interesting experiment. But just to say, I find that when I'm writing, or working on a poem, it definitely quiets my mind. It drops me into a quieter space.
So there's another genre of Buddhist poetry called awakening poems. And someone wrote in the question, have you ever written an awakening poem? And I was thinking, I wouldn't put you on the spot with that. That feels like a strange question to ask, perhaps. But then I was thinking, the bird song in the open sky of my mind is, as a reader, that feels like a moment of awakening. And I'm curious, maybe if you have any thoughts in response to that question.
Yeah, I think there is a strong tradition, in Buddhism. I think often, the Zen masters, enlightenment, they'll often express their enlightenment experience, with a poem. But that bird song, it has that flavor because not only does it collapse the duality, of me here and bird there, but it also, in a more subtle way, points to an understanding of the nature of awareness itself. And so if we settle into the real meaning of it and the implications of it, it can be quite an important realization of understanding the nature of awareness that can contain everything. So can I claim that as an awakening poem? The first one, anyway.
Well, thinking of the Chan and Zen traditions, like in the Platform Sutra, the sixth patriarch, the person who will become the sixth patriarch is determined by who writes a poem that manifests awakening. There are many other great poems where, we can have an experience as a student and think that it's an awakening experience, but we need something outside to check us. And it was the poem that I wrote that would manifest, well, was it an awakening experience or not, that the teacher could then evaluate. Yeah. Maybe that's something we should start doing in Barrie.
Yes, at the end of every retreat, people write their awakening poem. I like it.
I teach a lot at BCBS, I teach a lot of retreats that are essentially poetry retreats with a lot of writing of poetry and engaging classical Buddhist traditions through poems. And I have felt that many of the poems that have been shared have essentially been awakening poems. I don't know if I would say full awakening poems, but in that space, there's something remarkable, thinking about writing on retreat. There is something that can arise in that space that is really, really remarkable.
So I just looked down there's another short poem I wrote which has a flavor, the direction we're talking about. Long legs outstretched. Looking down, I wonder, who do they belong to? And it was that moment of just seeing these long legs and the moment of not really being identified with them, as being me. It's just this appearance, that I was seeing. And that feeling, the feeling was very vivid. Well, who do these belong to? And of course, they don't belong to anyone. So it was kind of a little glimpse into the understanding of selflessness. So I think there are kind of many different angles on this.
So we are coming to the end. I'm looking through to see if there's one last question on several pages of questions that I now have. That might lead to a relatively short response.
I'm not known for short responses.
Well, maybe your writing of poetry is... There are a handful of questions about, maybe this is a good, a short response question. There are a handful of questions from people who are interested in haiku. And I see that many people have a practice of doing one haiku a day as a practice of attention. And there are 4 or 5 questions here about haiku. In part, have you experimented with the form, which really allows the poet to pare away to the essence of thought and image, and what your thoughts are on haiku as a practice, as an accessible practice?
Right. So just a little background, that the poet friend of mine who gave me that initial advice that all poetry is a revision is quite a well-known American haiku poet. She's won all kinds of awards. Her name is Sylvia Forge Ryan. And she's published a couple of small books of her haiku, which I would highly recommend because I love them. And so I sent her, some of the poems that I thought were, in kind of haiku genre. But what I learned from her is that there's a lot of nuance to what really constitutes a haiku. It's not just the brevity of it. It's particularly uses of image and relating disparate things. So I think it's a fantastic discipline, and to practice. And it might be worth, for people interested in that form, to really delve into a little investigation, of the deeper aspects of what makes a haiku a haiku. I learned a lot from that. Initially I just thought, well, just 3 short lines, in certain syllables, but it's much more than that. And so learning about it, I think, would be really valuable. And for those interested, I really would recommend people reading some of her poems, which I have found to be completely wonderful.
That was a haiku length response, Joseph. Okay. So I think many of you who are on this call are familiar with the Sanskrit and Pali term dana, which is etymologically related to our English word donation. And in a Buddhist context, it refers to gift giving or generosity, which is the first virtue of the Bodhisattva, as it is both about relinquishing that to which we might be attached as we begin to soften the clinging to ourselves, but also meets the immediate needs of others. And one meaning of this term, as practiced in the institutions that Joseph co-founded here in Barrie, is the sense of generosity that leads teachers to offer their teaching freely. So without a contract, trusting in the generosity of all of us to support them. I personally find this a deeply inspiring, deeply moving practice in our world where so much is monetized, where so many of us might think of ourselves as entrepreneurs, that the practice of dana is kind of, I forget the exact phrase, opening a flowering of space. Joseph, I forget the term you used exactly, but it suggests an image that's an alternative to the kind of neoliberal way in which we deal with money these days. And Joseph has led his entire life on the Dana model, starting in his 20s. For me personally, it's really very moving to see somebody who has devoted their life to freely offering the teachings, writing, practicing, and doing an enormous amount of daily work to create and sustain complex and sometimes complicated institutions that are necessary for these practices to will both be a home for people to come to and train deeply and then go on and teach. These institutions where Joseph has lived pretty much his whole adult life are what is made possible, the flowering of this practice. So I'm deeply grateful to those of you who already offered dana when you registered. And I'm also aware that there are many different calls on our generosity. It was just Giving Tuesday, and I received a lot of emails from organizations that have great need also. So I realize this is complex. And I also realize that some of us are not in a life situation where this form of dana makes sense. And I trust that you will offer generously in many ways, whether or not you offer through our website. Just to say there's no pressure. And if you feel so moved, Mindy, if you could put a link to the dana in the, there it is. If in the chat, there's a link where you can offer dana that will be shared with Joseph and the Barrie Center for Buddhist Studies. There's also a survey link in the chat, and another form of dana is just to share with us how this evening landed for you and if you have any suggestions and ideas. And maybe, Joseph, if you'd be willing to bring this to a close with a short sit.
So that'd be an appropriate and nice thing to do. So let's just for a few minutes, sit comfortably. Again, settle into the body and let all the words dissolve, entering into a space of silence. Becoming intimate with the breath. Intimate with the body. Intimate with our thoughts and emotions. I knew myself completely, no part left out. May all beings be at peace.
Thank you, Joseph.
Yeah, well, thank all of you for this, my first public reading.
Mindy, would you be willing to? Mindy, would you be willing to take us off the spotlighted and so we could see the gallery view? So we could see everybody's face. And maybe, Joseph, did you want to say anything else?
No, I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I did.
Okay, and maybe we could, Mindy, if you want to let people speak, just to say goodnight and goodbye on the way out.
Thank you, Joseph.
Thank you, Joseph.
Thank you, Joseph. And thank you, William.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Gratitude,
William.
William.
Thank you,
Gratitude.
William.
Joseph, William.
Awesome.
Thank you, Joseph.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Good night.
Thank you.
Good night, all.
Good night.
It's
Really meaningful. Thank you.
Be well.
Thank you. Good night.
Night.
Good night, everyone.
Good night, all.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you.
Be well.
Joseph. How come I didn't register me?
Gracias, Joseph. Buenas noches.